Hello and welcome to tonight's webinar, Affirming Adults in the School Community. I'm Jacqueline. I use she pronouns and I'm an instructional designer here at EGAL. I'll mostly be hiding in the background, offering support and answering questions. But we'll start off by getting everyone oriented to the room. I just want to draw your attention to a few features at the bottom of your screen. You've got the Q&A, the chat, and the hand raise feature. So there'll be lots of opportunities to engage in different ways. There'll be a reserved Q&A portion at the end of the session. We'll do our best to address Q&A as it comes up throughout the session, but there'll be a chance to do so at the end. We want to note that participant lines are in listen-only mode, so you'll only be able to ask questions verbally. All questions and comments must be submitted in writing. For all other forms of discussion, we invite you to use the chat feature. We will also want to note that the closed captioning has been enabled for the session. So if you'd like to turn the closed captioning on or off, you can toggle your mouse over the CC button and you can press hide or show subtitles. And now that you're familiar with our room, I'd like to offer a few brief comments on EGAL for those of you who are new to us. EGAL is a national organization working to improve the lives of 2S LGBTQI people in Canada and around the world by informing public policy, inspiring cultural change, and promoting human rights and inclusion through research, education, and legal advocacy. Our vision is a Canada and ultimately a world without homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and all other forms of oppression, so that every person can achieve their full potential free from hatred and bias. Connecting with folks such as yourselves is just one way that we're able to advance our mission. So we thank you so much for taking the initiative to join us tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our wonderful presenter, Katie. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks, Jack. I really appreciate that. I'm so glad you're all here. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. I'm just sorry if I was wiggling around there trying to make sure that the sun is in the right spot. I have lots of windows in the space I'm in tonight, so. Before we get started, it's important for us to do a land acknowledgement. And I don't know if you folks are doing this in your spaces. We have had a few discussions here at EGAL about the best way to do this when we are doing a webinar or a teaching such as this, where we see people coming from all different places. I think Jack let me know today that we actually have representation from almost every province and actually some outside of Canada today. So when we're doing a land acknowledgement with people on all different places on Turtle Island, we have decided to the way that we've problem solved that is to acknowledge the land where the facilitator or facilitators are teaching from. So I'm teaching from the Windsor, Essex area in Ontario, and I'm sitting on the traditional lands of the Three Fires Confederacy. So that includes the Ottawa people, the Potawatomi people, and the Ojibwe people. And we just like to acknowledge that we are doing this really important work on traditional lands, because it is absolutely essential when we're talking about concepts of race, gender, and sexuality and oppression, that we recognize they are largely based in white Western colonial systems of thought. Especially, I think we'd like to acknowledge this in the findings from residential schools over the last couple of months here in Canada and on a world stage has really brought this issue into the light for those folks who may not have already been aware of the struggles for First Nations folks. So it's an important way, if you're doing this work in your own spaces, to make sure to start your work off in an intersectional way. My name is Katie Casey, and you can tell that this is a pre-COVID picture because my hair is short and I was able to go get haircuts, so not so much right now, but I use the pronouns she and her. Just a little bit briefly about myself is I've been primarily working in the anti-oppression and anti-sexual violence sector for the last 10 years. I'm currently working at the University of Windsor, where I teach a resiliency-based course. I've been working for EGAL for the last 7 or 8 years now, and I live in the county with my wife Megan and our 3 kiddos. I have 8-month-old twins. So I was telling Jack that teaching tonight actually feels like a bit of a break because I left my wife with bedtime. So I'm very glad to be here with you all. Just a quick brief overview of what we're going to be doing together tonight. The first piece that we're going to be talking about is why affirming adults are as vital as they ever have been. So why is it important that we're talking about this, and why is it important that you're learning how to be an effective affirming adult? The second piece that we're going to be talking about is preventing and mitigating harm, which we'll get a little bit more into in the second portion of tonight. We're also going to be talking about promising practices in the classroom and beyond. So it is really hard for us. We always kind of get the feedback that people want really concrete strategies to take back to their classrooms. And we're going to try and give you as many of those as possible. But inside of 75 minutes, it can be a bit challenging to give you a detailed plan. So we encourage you to check out our website. The webinar tonight is designed to kind of give you the structure and the introduction on how to be a skilled affirming adult, and then we will be giving you some resources throughout the webinar to help you kind of hone those skills more concretely. Jack, I'm just going to shift because I'm noticing the lights right on my face. Sorry about that, folks. The sun is setting, and when we practiced, that was not the case here. So I did not recognize my face was going to be quite so complicated. That's better. And then finally, we're going to hope to have some time for questions and comments at the end. So Jack will be monitoring the chat as we kind of go. And there is, as Jack said, a designated question and answer area. So if you have something urgent, hopefully one of us will catch it. But otherwise, we're going to try and move through the content pretty quickly to make sure that we have time for everything tonight. So our first piece of work together is we would like you to guess the stat. So we would like to know what you think about how much more likely do you think it is for 2S LGBTQI youth to report good or excellent mental health when they have a supportive adult, both inside and outside their home environment. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to respond. Excellent. So you folks nailed it right off the bat. 2S LGBTQI youth with supportive folks at home or inside or outside their family are 4 times more likely to report good or excellent mental health. So the study that we're going to be talking about pretty frequently tonight is the Still in Every Classroom study. And some of the quotes that we've pulled and are going to share with you are from that study. And some of the things that students, they shared in their in their responses to this study around having supportive adults were things like, I had a handful of teachers who were very supportive and receptive to our frustrations as LGBTQ students. I want them to know how appreciated they are. They saved my life. Most teachers at my school are often wearing some sort of form of ally shirt, whether it be a Love is Love shirt or a Pride shirt or an equality shirt. It helped me so much in feeling of safety in my school. And I mainly feel safe because I have people that are willing to help and protect me. Not everyone at my school has access to that, especially not when they're facing against their own family members. So we share these quotes with you because we think it's really important for you to realize that you may not even know the impact that you're having on the students and folks in your spaces. You may not know that you are one of the most affirming or supportive or that light in somebody's proverbial space. And I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we move through the content today, because you also might not know that a 2S LGBTQI person is in your space, and you may be creating a safer space for them without even knowing it. And it's just such an important thing to be doing in your schools, in your communities. So when we were thinking here at EGAL about what kind of things would characterize an affirming environment, we were thinking about things like spaces would be where students can safely, comfortably question, develop, and express themselves, where students are positively reflected in the culture around them, where they can interact with others with shared experiences and social identities, where they can feel supported by affirming adults they trust, and they can achieve their potential free from bias, hatred, and violence. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on. And I know that some of you are coming to us as educators or support staff, but some of you are also coming to us from community. And we're going to talk in a little bit more about what are the really concrete positive outcomes for students and folks who feel supported and affirmed by their environments and the people around them. So that's the list that we came up with. I'm wondering if there's anything that you would like to add to that. So I can go back a little bit and you can take a look. And if there's anything that you would like to add or that you are doing in your own spaces, then please feel free to add this in the chat. It is challenging for us to create an experience for you as participants where we are able to have a whole lot of back and forth when we have such a time crunch and so much content. But the chat is a really effective way for you to share resources literally across the country. And in some instances across North America, because we have some folks coming to us from the States as well. So please feel free as I'm talking to light up the chat with content that you want to add, because you'll be able to review that as we go. So before we talk about how to be an affirming adult or an affirming person, I think we have to have a bit of a brief discussion about what does it mean to be affirming. So this is a list that we have come up with, and I would be happy for you to add in your pieces through personal experience if that you feel like that would be helpful. But the first one that we decided on was that it needed to be proactive, so rather than reactive. So we want to be acting in a way that is highlighting our support for the 2S LGBTQI community before we know there's anybody in our spaces, in our classrooms or our communities. So we're wanting to be acting in ways, making sure that policies are in place, that contents in our classrooms and our syllabi, or that media is represented in our community spaces before we actually see or know that there is somebody who identifies as 2S LGBTQI in our spaces. So we want to be doing this just kind of as a blanket way of acting proactively rather than reacting when we find out that there's been an issue or that somebody has felt like they were not being affirmed in our spaces or our classrooms. You also really explicit about your identity as an affirming adult. So erasure and silence are definitely forms of discrimination, and lukewarm tolerance really isn't enough. I can tell you that I have been out for, personally, I'm 13 years. So I have been, and the amount of times that I have experienced kind of that lukewarm support or tolerance never feels very good for me as a member of the queer community. And it's really necessary that we are explicit about naming that we are allies, about creating identifiers in our space, and like I mentioned, making sure that you have content in your syllabi and in your classrooms, and being really vocal about our support, not just not saying anything against the 2S LGBTQI community. Next is supportive. So I'm sure that many of you, if you're coming to us as educators and community support folks, I think Jack said we have some folks who are community agencies as well. That is my background. I worked at sexual assault centers for a really long time before starting to do this work that you probably already know. part of this, but we really like to highlight that we're taking the co-pilot approach. So when we are having somebody in our spaces or our circles that is coming out to us or needing support, then we want to act in a way that they are the pilot of their experience, and we're just kind of navigate through those resources. So that means that we sometimes had the reaction where we think that we know what they need best. So we do things like, you know, we're going to get you connected with this agency, and we're going to get you connected with this resource, and we're going to tell these people. And it's really important for us to slow down and really explicitly ask the question, what would you find most helpful right now? And if they're not sure, then offering up options for support instead of a really concrete plan and kind of dictating what that process looking for support is going to look like. So we want to make sure that we are including the individuals in our support model as well. The next one is action-based. So this means that this is kind of, as we're moving up the tier of being affirming adults, we're maybe done some learning ourselves, we're being proactive, and if the instance comes up, we're being explicit, we know how to be supportive, but the next kind of piece is being really action-based and acting on the beliefs that you have. So things like creating spaces, backing up words with action, and doing things like encouraging your coworkers to come to these sorts of sessions, recognizing days of importance, or bake sales, movie screenings, supporting your local GSAs in really active ways. It's really important that there are words put, or there are actions put to the words, and this is can be one of the most challenging pieces, and hopefully towards the end today we'll have a little bit more time to share with each other how you have done that in your own home spaces. I know that one of my favorite ones is when they're talking about GSAs and creating community a couple of months ago. They were saying that the head of the GSA actually connected with another GSA, and they were sending postcards back and forth between the members, and really actively creating community that was broader than their own. And I thought that was really beautiful. So just another example, and we love to always hear about all of the creative things that you're doing. The next piece is humility. So this is probably, I would say, one of the hardest pieces for you and for me to really actively practice on the regular when we're trying to be better at being affirming adults. So oftentimes, one of the things that we hear the most often at EGAL, the barriers to being an affirming adult really effectively, is that they're afraid to mess up or to say something wrong or to hurt somebody's feelings or to cause damage by doing something wrong. So they choose to do nothing at all. And I would just really like to encourage you to not let that be a barrier for you. Instead, really thinking about how you could practice humility if you do have a misstep. So if you misgender somebody or you use the wrong terminology, really kind of almost having that script in the back of your mind about how you're going to say, you know what, I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to learn how to do that better. And I'm going to really aim to have that not happen again for you. I didn't mean any disrespect by that, or whatever your kind of narrative is. It could be really helpful for you to kind of have that because it will be a barrier for you to being an effective affirming adult. And we hate to see that happen when folks have good intentions. And finally, accountability. So this one kind of speaks for itself, but making sure that you're being accountable for your actions, that you're continuing to learn, and that you're also, when possible and safe, creating accountability in your classrooms, your schools, and your communities. And we would love to hear anything else from you once again in the chat if you have a thing to add. Yeah, Jack.
Amplify something that someone shared in the chat about holding a pride group in their high school that is student run. It kind of fits in with some of the themes that you were speaking about around being in a supporting role, and actually like feeding them resources and support from afar, but letting it be kind of like a safer space for just the students themselves.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, thank you. See, these are things that are so people are doing pretty innovative things, and it's great to hear that. So I'm so glad that you've taken that approach. Okay, so I did just, sorry, I got ahead of myself with the slide there by asking you if there's anything you wanted to add. But really explicitly, when it comes to characteristics of being affirming, is there anything you would like us to know about what you're doing or what something that we didn't cover? Please feel free to add that in the chat. Is there anything that's come up that needs to be shared, Jack, or we want to keep moving along?
We'll keep an eye on it and we'll alert you if something comes. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I always laugh when I had this computer, the webcam is in the bottom of the screen, so my hands always look really big when I'm changing slides, which makes me laugh. We do want to touch next on protecting 2S LGBTQI youth's right to privacy and just how incredibly important that is, especially during the global pandemic that we are experiencing, because that has amplified and shifted the ways that we interact with our students and the folks in our communities, and has in some ways protected privacy and sometimes made it more challenging. So I just, again, from the same Still in Every Classroom studies, some of the students shared with their experiences of their privacy either not being protected or seeing that in their schools. So the principal outed me to my parents without warning me first, making me feel unsafe around her and not trusting her with any future problems that I might have. Another student said, don't out kids to their parents. I've seen it happen and it can be incredibly harmful. When a student wants to change the name and pronouns they go by at school for reasons I don't understand, the parent must be made aware. I feel like schools should take the child's safety into consideration more in these circumstances. If a child is outed to an unsupportive parent, it can put the child in serious danger. Most of the time you don't know, and what a kid's home life is like, school might be the only place they feel like they can be themselves. And having to make the parent aware of a change in name and pronouns can cause a kid to lose their sense of safety that they may have had at school. Overall, I feel like this needs to be rethought. It's understandable, and I get why this would need to happen, but there needs to be a different way to go about it. So I'm sure that privacy, rights to privacy is an issue in your own spaces. I know that I think we were going to share, I'm blanking on the name of the document right now, Jack, but we had a document prepared where if your GSA is online, we were talking about this in another webinar when we shifted to at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were not looking at a return to school at that time. We were sending out kind of like a GSA document where we were asking students to share with us, like, if you're on a video call, is it safe to use, these pronouns? What pronouns do you want us to use? What name do you want us to use? And making sure that we were aware of and creating as safe as possible spaces online for students as we were meeting in that forum. Yeah, Jack.
So I've put it in the chat. It's called a needs and wants form, and that could be a model for.
Yeah, and also a great model, I think, for as we're looking at, we've been talking a lot about this, the return to the physical classroom. This can, I think, still really be an applicable document to use with your students who are in GSAs. It allows us to know a bit more about them and just kind of be, going back to the characteristics of an affirming adult in spaces, being proactive about making sure that privacy is protected in those spaces. Okay. So speaking of the pandemic, we do need to have a bit of a discussion about lasting pandemic impacts on 2S LGBTQI youth. So this has been a bit of a, for lack of a better term, proverbial like double-edged sword. So for some students, we've seen an increase in exposure to non-affirming environments and relationships. As we saw back in the quotes that were shared from students, sometimes school was the only place where they felt like they had spaces where they were being affirmed and safe and could wholly kind of who they were and share that piece of their identity. And beyond that, even if it was just a passive closeting of their identities, some students have also been experiencing outwardly hostile home environments, or have been living in spaces where they are not only not affirmed, but experiencing really intense homophobia for the last year and a half. So we want to think about we all know and have been having broad conversations about the mental health impacts for students and also some staff and community members about living in those kind of environments. We've also seen an increase in stressors or compound stressors for those already struggling. So we do know, and we've taught a whole other webinar about the compound kind of oppressions that can be experienced for members of the 2S LGBTQI community. But we have seen, higher unemployment rates. We have seen higher rates of mental health issues. We have people have felt isolated, and for folks who are already feeling isolated and maybe had a small community at school, that was removed. So really thinking about those pieces. Also shrinking access to affirming environments and relationships. So I actually think this can kind of go, as we're thinking about going back to school, thinking about there have been some really wonderful and creative and fulsome online spaces created, and we actually are going to talk about the importance of maintaining those. But for some folks, we have seen we might see shrinking access to that going back to school. And also for some of our students, they may have, when the pandemic started, lost the access to those school relationships that were affirming for them. So we're going to see, because of the complex identities of all of our students and staff, for some people, this pandemic was a bit of a relief in some ways, and an increased access to affirming spaces and folks. And for some people, it decreased their access to both affirming spaces and adults. And it's really important for us, as we think about, again, shifting into the school year this September, to recognize that all of our folks are not going to be coming from the same place, and really kind of triaging that is an important piece of the work. Also, I think it's important to mention that I know that in my daughter's school, there's lots of talk about planning for the return to school, and plexiglass and masks and sanitizing, and how we're shifting the curriculum to be able to be delivered safely because of COVID-19. And because of that, we're seeing a deprioritization of support for initiatives for 2S LGBTQI students, in contrast to the preparation, the other preparations for returning to school that will be happening. So I just really, I'm so glad you're all here. I think that as we shift again, I would just encourage you to keep those kind of nuances in mind. Also, I think because we have seen in the last year and a half the necessity of a community-wide approach for learning and also affirming our 2S LGBTQI students and staff. So we have seen that it is really important for parents, caregivers, and guardians to be affirming adults. It's important to have community adult allies, having administrators on board, educators, support staff, extracurricular staff, student peers. I know that what has happened for so many of us is that our work and our school environments are really kind of bleeding into one another in a way that we haven't seen before. So I know that I have been conducting work meetings while feeding a baby, and my 5-year-old is learning about, how to make bubbles in JK, and my mother-in-law has had to come over to help with the other baby. So we have seen community blending and shifting in a way this year that we haven't actually seen before. And it has really allowed for us to see, it is so apparent that all of these different pieces of the community need to come together to be creating affirming spaces and messaging for our students. Because prior to the pandemic, we saw a lot of siloing of the listed possibilities for affirming spaces or adults. And when a student was experiencing and feeling affirmed in one space but not in another, we weren't always seeing the crossover between that and the effects on the students themselves. And now that we are kind of all having the ability to kind of see into each other's spaces, it becomes so much more apparent that it needs to really be a community-wide approach. I also would love to hear from you just in the chat if you feel like you have been supported this year or have experienced or given support in a way that you wouldn't have thought imaginable prior to the pandemic. So I think that this has been such a terrible experience for so many people, and I want to acknowledge that absolutely. I think it has also really created space for us to learn about what support can look like in ways that we wouldn't have considered prior to the pandemic. So I know for myself, I had my twins at 27 weeks this year, and I had micro preemies in a global pandemic, and people showed up for us in ways that were just really unbelievable. Like, they were sending us care packages at the hospital and offering to watch my daughter because of COVID restrictions. Only my wife and I were allowed into the NICU. So we couldn't have that normal support that we would have pre-pandemic, where you can have other family members come in and give you relief. It was only us all the time. People really showed up for us in ways that were unbelievable. And people in particular that I wouldn't have necessarily expected in really lovely ways. So I would encourage you, if you've experienced support in a new way, either personally or professionally, to share that in the chat. Yeah.
While we're waiting for folks to share in the chat, I just wanted to also comment that we had some folks in the registration share that they are sitting in an affirming position for youth outside of their own family. And so that's such an important thing, and amplifies what you're kind of saying, Katie. Just wanted to share that.
Great. Jack, how am I doing for time right now? I just want to check in really briefly. Good? Okay, great. I would love to actually run a webinar where we have time for Q&A at the end. That would be really nice. Okay. So again, this is information that came from the Still in Every Classroom study. And it's important for you to know that 30% of the respondents who were 2S LGBTQI experienced harassment, versus only 8% who were cisgender or heterosexual compared to their 2S LGBTQI peers. So we are seeing a lot more bullying and harassment within that community. And we need to just talk briefly about what causes the reluctance to seek support. So when there is a lack of affirming environments or affirming adults. So things like low confidence that staff would do anything. They didn't want to be outed. So maybe the student had an experience, and sharing that or asking for help or reporting it would require them to out themselves, and they didn't want to do that. They were concerned for safety and a fear of retaliation. Usually this came from other students, but we did see some messaging in the study about also that not coming from just their peers, which is really disappointing. And they said the school staff are queerphobic themselves. So comments that are made, things that are said that would send the message to students that the school staff themselves were queerphobic, and that school staff were actually part of the harassment. So making jokes or saying things or acting in ways that would signal to the students that they were queerphobic and part of the harassment themselves. Some of the students had things to say like, I hate how when I'm taunted and insulted and yelled at constantly, it's considered as everyday regular bullying, when the difference is because I'm queer and I stand up for my fellow queer students. I was given death threats and nothing was done besides giving a slap of the hand to my bully. It needs to be understood that the suffering of queer students in school is different from those of straight people. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, about the nuances of that in a little bit when we talk about kind of refining our lenses. Another student said, include people. The teachers at my school talk about how important LGBTQ students are, but they never make actions. Yeah, okay, putting the pride sign on the classroom doors, but they get ripped down and made fun of and nothing is done. My school only talks. The teachers do not bring in speakers and punish hard and check up on students included in LGBTQ and see if there's anything they need and if they're okay. So this is one of the really concrete examples of when we were going back a few slides to the characteristics of an affirming adult, the importance of there being action-based things happening in your classrooms, your spaces, your schools, and your communities, because we can talk about this all we want, but for sure the 2S LGBTQI folks in your spaces are taking note and noticing whether there are actually any actions, consequences, or proactive, learning or safer space attempts being made in their schools. So when we talk about promising practices for prevention and intervention on anti-LGBTQI bullying, we want to talk about protecting privacy, which we kind of already touched on. And I think there's a whole webinar that we can share with you about online bullying for 2S LGBTQI folks that you can actually access. I think Jack if you just nod, did you put that in the chat there? Yeah, so you can check that out. It is excellent. And I know I'm biased, but I don't actually teach that webinar, and I did check it out when I started to do this one, and the resources are really concrete and they're really easy to follow. So there's some really great promising practices for keeping your online spaces affirming and safe. We don't have time to go into them tonight, but I would for sure encourage you to check those out. It's also really important that we're frameworks to the work that we are doing. So when I say this, I think that it's really, when we kind of start to do the affirming adult piece of work, we think about being allies to us LGBTQI folks, and this is great. But we also need to kind of layer on to that is the understanding that 2S LGBTQI folks are not just one-dimensional human beings. There's so many different facets to our personalities and our existences, and it's really important that we recognize the really nuanced oppressions that interact and produce experiences of harassment and bullying and homophobia that are particular to those individuals. So using an anti-oppressive framework when we are doing the work is definitely an excellent promising practice to start implementing. We also talked about being proactive as well as responsive. So we want to be thinking about what we're going to be doing if we see an instance of homophobia, bullying, or harassment in our schools before they happen. This is really, I think, one of the most practical pieces of information that I can think of that we can talk about in these sorts of webinars is having a plan before it happens, before your kind of like fight or flight response kicks in. Having an idea of what it is that you're going to do before something happens is really going to help you to be able to respond more calmly and effectively in the moment. And then also, I think when we're talking about ways to be responsive is once you kind of have that plan in place. Also, I think it's important to think about what you're going to do to take care of yourself after intervening in one of those instances, because it can take a lot of emotional labor to do that. I'm just going to, I see the chat really lighting up here, so I'm just going to check these. Great. I just want to make sure I wasn't missing anything in the chat as we went. And then I think finally, it's really important when we think about promising practices to think about learning to refine your lens. So we think about the really nuanced ways that homophobia can show up in your spaces, classrooms, and communities. I know that there tends to be this kind of, or has been this sort of narrative around, you know, same-sex couples can get married now, so, you know, like, it's a different world. And I know that so for example, my dad really struggled when I came out, and very much kind of prescribes that idea that like homophobia is not nearly as much of a thing as it was when he was in high school. I keep encouraging him to come to these webinars, but I haven't been able to get him to come yet. And if you were to say to him that he was homophobic, he would very much argue that fact. He would say that's not the case. But a little while ago, we were visiting, and my son, Wild, who was 6 months old at the time, was wearing a bonnet. It was June, and he was wearing a bonnet for sun protection, and my dad was just mortified that we would put a bonnet on a boy. And he really, I think, has not refined his lens around thinking about like how, you know, transphobic, homophobic, misogynistic, like all those pieces that was in that moment. So it's really important for us to start thinking, you know, wherever you're at, about what are the more kind of nuanced ways that you're both seeing and perhaps even participating in discriminatory or oppressive kind of language or practices in your own spaces, to kind of check with yourself and see what you're seeing out there. Anybody want to add anything in the chat? All good. Oh, I see one there. No problem, Jen. I hope nobody knows my dad in this webinar. He probably would not be thrilled with me, but it's really important for us to think about that. You know, he comes from a really good intentioned place, and this is, I think, when we're thinking about how this really plays out in our day-to-day lives, very well, not rarely, but often we're seeing a more nuanced form of homophobia, and sometimes the form of homophobia that folks themselves would not even label as homophobia. And how do we have those sorts of conversations, and how do we push back at that and create affirming spaces and be affirming folks ourselves in the face of that? I think that is important. If it's helpful for you, how we responded to that was, we have had the conversation where we said, if you're going to say things like that about our son and continue to kind of you know, kind of push that agenda of toxic masculinity around him, then the option is that your time with him will be limited, and we really don't want that to happen. We want him to be able to know you and see you, but you can't say things like that around him. It's problematic. So I don't know if that's helpful for you folks. I know sometimes having courageous conversations can be a really hard thing to do. I hear you on that one. Okay. So next, we're going to do a poll where I'm going to ask you to rate your level of preparedness to the following scenario. And we are not going to have time for us to really delve into picking this scenario apart. What I would like and invite you to think about doing is using this scenario as kind of a checking in with yourself moment about how you're feeling. So you learn of a recent incident in which a student has been outed online to their peers without their consent. You are not sure how the targeted student identifies or whether or not they have an affirming environment at home. And so the options here are, do you know exactly what you would do? Do you need some time to think about it first? Or you really have no clue? And this is anonymous. So if you have no clue, you can answer that way. That's all right. We won't be sharing identities for folks. But this is a good kind of check for you to think about, where do your next steps need to be in your own journey of learning? Okay, so 41% of you said, I know exactly what I would do. 53% of you said, I'd need some time to think about it first. And 6% said, I really have no clue. So thanks for your honest responses. And hopefully we will have some time for the Q&A at the end. And if we need to chat about that, we can. Or this has given you a better direction for where to go and kind of next steps for learning for yourself personally. Okay. So beyond thinking about just our environments and ourselves, we also need to think about representation in the classroom and beyond. So this is really practical. When people are asking us for practical information, these are some of the really practical ways that you can create environment and words are hard, affirming environments and be affirming adults yourselves and in really concrete ways in your own spaces. So things like connections across disciplines. So when we're thinking about representation for the 2S LGBTQI community, are we thinking about beyond just like health class? Are there examples of when you're doing math problems and you're talking about a family? Are there different representations of family or identities in those math problems, science problems? Is there things like, are there 2S LGBTQI characters in the books that you're assigning readings for in your English class? Are you teaching true history in your history classes in your spaces, making sure that it's kind of across disciplines? That you're using gender inclusive language and practices. So we want to think about, we don't want to say like, hey guys and girls. We want to be thinking about like, hey folks, glad you're here. We're not doing things like splitting students up into teams of boys and girls, that we're doing things like using birthdays or favorite colors or day of the month that you were born type ways to divide classrooms, just really practical things like that. I will say to you also, just things like I had to take my son to an allergist last week, and the form said mother's occupation and father's occupation still in 2021. So things just like the forms that you're using, are they both inclusive of, you know, people's sexual orientations and attractions, but also their identities? Do we need to, like, do we need the ticky boxes of male or female? Can we leave those spaces open? Just really like practical, inclusive language and practices. Recognizing days of significance is a great way to kind of create representation in your schools. That people have done things like, you know, screenings of films or online gathering, discussion groups, panels, things like that, ways, or even just like visual representations, which is another option that we're going to talk about down here around days of significance. Making sure that you're making it intersectional. We talked about this. So not just looking at 2S LGBTQI folks as one-dimensional, but really making sure that we are coming at, we can't pick apart people's experiences really cleanly, and we really need to honor and recognize the experience of 2S LGBTQI folks who have other aspects of their identity where they may be experiencing oppression. So it's really important for you to be also doing things intersectionally. Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Catholic school boards will only list male or female for families when they are registering their children to attend from K to 12. I know this is, I mean, this is a real problem as far as just really accessibility, and even just seeing yourself represented in the registration forms for things like medical offices and schools. It really just right from the very beginning says that there isn't a space for you here, that there isn't like a label, or and we're not prepared already for that to welcome who you are kind of into our space. So I'm sorry that that's the case, but thank you for sharing that with us.
In the context of, you know, an affirming, you don't mind me interjecting, of an
No.
affirming webinar, I'd love people to kind of think creatively about some ways to like take action around that, or what are some ways to push that forward in your school?
Yeah, and this is one that comes up a lot for us, and it really does take a lot of pushback. We're going to talk about that. Also thinking about, oh, went backwards. That's not what I wanted. Sorry, folks. Also, when we're thinking about visual and digital culture, so the, you know, the pride triangles and flags in your spaces. I know that my sister-in-law has like a rainbow lanyard that she is at school to kind of like signify that she is an affirming adult. Also thinking about the digital culture that is being curated online. So there's many folks that are still going to be doing the online only learning come September. So still also thinking about how do we create affirming environments online as well, because I don't think that's going away anytime soon. And I think that if you were to check out some of the resources on EGAL's website, we do have a whole piece on online GSAs. And I did actually run one of those and had some great recommendations for kind of how to create representation in your digital spaces as well as your physical ones. So what we heard from students about 2S LGBTQI inclusion in the classroom, things like my teacher began using gender neutral pronouns as a default when teaching. It would also be fantastic if more 2S LGBTQIA history was taught, and when showing examples, having more open queer representation. In English class, we were discussing discrimination, and my English teacher that I really respected said there also might be some LGBTQ discrimination, but does not think it is as much of an issue anymore after gay marriage was legalized. She was hanging out with my dad. She had an open discussion about all discrimination, such as racial or religious, but not queer. Me and one other student tried to voice a different perspective, but the discussion quickly moved away from anything LGBT. I had previously felt accepted by that teacher, and if she had known that I was queer, right, but now I can't feel as at ease in her class anymore. And it only forced me deeper into the closet at school. I really wish cis het students and teachers were more aware of the impact of their words and how hurtful it can be to their peers. So finally, another student said, literally anything taught about the LGBT community would be helpful. I shouldn't have to learn everything on a private browser in my bedroom, hiding my search history from my parents so I could learn about the community and everything related to it. Oh, that one really gets me. And I know as an adult woman, every June, I have to have the discussion about like the first Pride was a riot and where that comes from, the history of Pride Month. And for those of you, if you're looking for a place to start, that might be a really good one, because we tend to think that is broad knowledge, but I don't actually think that it is as much as we would like to think. Okay, so the next thing that I would like to invite you to do is to share the ways that you've integrated 2S LGBTQI representation into your classrooms in creative or unexpected ways. So this is one of those instances where I just really encourage you to share your own promising practices that you are doing in your own schools. Many of us are looking for creative ways to do this, and it's so good to just kind of like get that information from other folks. Yeah, Jack?
Yes, I want to share something that came up earlier in the chat, totally related to this. It's a small thing, thanking someone instead of for correcting you if you slip up, instead of apologizing. The focus doesn't then have to be on the student who was on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, I love that approach. Thanks for sharing that. I actually think this too allows things to move a little bit more smoothly. So if you're just say, thanks for letting me know, I really appreciate that, the opportunity to learn that, and then you can kind of move along. It doesn't need to be like such a big apologetic moment where it draws unnecessary attention. So great way to be more inclusive in your own spaces.
Someone else is sharing whether or not individuals are part of XYZ group or identity are in our classrooms. We have to treat the space as if they are, because they exist and they matter, and not just any representation, but authentic representation.
Yeah, you know what I always think of, and I always say to Jack before we do these that I don't want to, like, in my own lens right now, in my own world, I have a 5-year-old and 8-month-old twins, and I think about we don't know what Indigo's attraction is yet, but I am so grateful to her kindergarten teachers who, when they're telling stories or doing crafts or doing activities, that they are including representation of people that look like her moms and families that look like ours. So, maybe in kindergarten, it's not really obvious to us that, 2S LGBTQI folks are like in the room as our students, but it's so essential. You're right. Like they are, they exist and they matter. Like that term, those words are just really lovely, Jennifer. I think it really sets the foundation for for feeling affirmed moving forward. So thanks so much for sharing that. Come on. Okay. So we want to think about generating buy-in and responding to resistance, because this is going to be a real thing. We see this come up every time we do a webinar or we teach a workshop. And these are some of the ways that we talk about generating buy-in and responding to resistance. Oh, I love Kahoot. Yes, I'm trying to keep track of the chat tonight as well, because you folks are really like the responses are rich. So and the entire school played at the same time. Oh, lovely! So you included the whole school. I love that. I use Kahoot a lot in my online teachings at the college and the university. So one of the things that we want to think about doing moving forward is having courageous conversations. And this is a hard one to muster. I always joke that I am not always everybody's first pick as a dinner guest, because I'm not someone who oftentimes will let like homophobic, racist, misogynistic kind of jokes or the kind of nuanced things that we see happen in our social spaces kind of go unchecked. And I think a lot of us are often really afraid of the pushbacks that we're going to experience in our personal relationships, and how do we even have those conversations. And I would encourage you to think about how you would approach those before the situations happen, kind of going back to that proactive piece, because and you need to find a way that feels authentic to you. So I can be quite sarcastic, and that's just comfortable for me as a person, and kind of like a deadpan humor. So one of the ways that I've come up with having courageous conversations when people tell homophobic jokes that I don't think are funny, either just like not laughing, if you're not comfortable having an overt conversation, really sends a message itself. The person feels real awkward and uncomfortable when nobody laughs at their jokes, or even saying something like, "So please explain to me how that's funny." Like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand what it is that you're saying. Can you explain it to me? Often is a way that if you're kind of getting your feet wet around having courageous conversations without having to, whip out your PowerPoint presentation and your slide deck at dinner, kind of asking those sorts of questions is a bit more of a gentler way to push back than having, like the overt ones, if that's not something you're comfortable with. And thanks for those resources on courageous conversations, Jack. I definitely encourage you to check that out. Second, we'd say, like, you have to learn so that you can teach. Jack is one of she creates so much of our content here at EGAL, and I always say to her that when I'm learning to teach her webinars, I feel like I learn something every time I go through a new slide deck. So it's really important for us to continue to learn so that you can teach. You have to, I think it's the old adage, like, if you can teach it, you know it really well. So continuing to learn new language, new research, new promising practices so that you can feel confident in teaching them to other folks is really important. When you do find that you are experiencing pushback, oftentimes we see this with maybe like religious communities or just like overworked or perceivably overworked administration. You want to find common ground about sharing. We know how important it is to create safe spaces for our students to learn. We know the outcomes are better for our students when they feel safe to come to school and to learn, and we know that that's really important for the education of our students. Or when we're thinking about kind of sometimes the pushback from religious organizations or folks, thinking about how important it is to practice kindness and the validity of each human life feeling like safe, like coming, if you're not able to agree at kind of like the higher level, thinking about finding common ground at a really base place. Emphasizing the collective benefit. So thinking about if our 2S LGBTQI students feel safer, chances are that our students who are struggling with mental health or are lower income or are part of a racialized community are also probably going to feel safer as kind of like a result of us working to create safer spaces for a different community. So making sure that we understand that when 2S LGBTQI folks feel safer, likely many other people are also going to feel safer when they see that there is an overt attempt to create affirming spaces. Also underscore the urgency. So we know that students who feel safer to come to school and learn, they just do better. They do better academically. Their mental health outcomes are better. The need for resources in our schools and communities is lower. And that is happening now. You know, I think it's really important to underscore that this is something that can't afford to wait a couple of semesters, a couple of weeks, or a couple of months. Our students, oftentimes, especially at a secondary level, are only with us for a few years. So waiting years to implement these promising practices is not great. Yeah, Jack?
I just wanted to share that the still in every classroom, where all of those quotes came from, a recently published study that EGAL did has some hard numbers to back up the advocacy work that you're doing in your school. So I encourage folks to check out the Still in Every Class report and think about how they might use that data in the work they're doing.
Okay. And then the idea of coming with solutions. So sometimes if you have an idea of what might be the pushback from your administration or your community or your space, just kind of trying to brainstorm what those pushback pieces might be and coming with solutions to them. So, you know, saying that we're overrun with the putting into practical practice how to do, you know, hybrid learning come the fall. We don't have the time to do online GSAs, for example, you know, making the argument that this has already been happening. It's already thriving. We just have to maintain it, and how, you know, that's not going to be an issue, or, you know, whatever you're thinking that the particular pushback might be for your area, thinking about coming in with solutions instead of problems and expecting them to problem solve. Because you have somebody who's already kind of on the fence, it might push them to not kind of coming around if you don't come with solutions. So just kind of coming with those pre-prepared can be a great idea. Maybe having conversations with other affirming folks in your spaces so that you can kind of think tank about what might be the common pushback, so that, and then think tanking about what those possible solutions can be, might be a great way to kind of crowdsource that information. And also building a critical mass. So, you know, being the only person that's doing the generating a buy-in and responding and pushing back is exhausting, for you, and also not the most effective way to get buy-in. So if you, before approaching whatever, you know, administration it is that you need to, or person that you need to approach to kind of get buy-in, thinking about, can you get allies in your schools, in your parent groups? And we went back to that community-wide approach slide where we realized how important it is to have buy-in from, you know, caregivers, classroom supports, teachers, community folks, how much representation you can get, and from different spaces. It might be a great idea to thinking about pushing your actions forward. Okay, we have just another poll check-in for you here. And again, this is not, we're not gonna have time to kind of really fully unpack this, but we'd like you to rate your level of preparedness to respond. So your school's GSA has proposed to hold a moment of silence on Trans Day of Remembrance. The proposal has been denied by the school's administration because of the backlash they expect from families in the school community. And we would love to hear your options again, or I know exactly what I do, I need some time to think this through, or I really have no clue. Great, there's lots of you that know exactly what you would do, which is wonderful. Great. So 57% of you said no, you knew exactly what you would do, and 43% said that you'd need some time to think about it, but you might have some sort of idea. So again, this is just where we invite you to kind of think about where your strengths and areas for learning might be moving forward. Yeah, Jack?
Wanted to invite people, while we still have a few minutes, if they have ideas about how to respond to either of the scenarios we presented, to share those in the chat if they'd like.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that, Jack, I might have broken a record ever and have, with 1 minute to spare, gotten to we got the timing down. I just want to, before we move into the chat, just say to you, if respecting folks' time constraints, if you have to leave us right at 8:15, that small actions times lots of people equals big change. And we recognize here at EGAL the immense energy it has taken so many of you to survive, get through, thrive during the pandemic. We know the bleeding in and out of our different spheres of life, and I just really want to acknowledge that showing up here tonight to spend time with us to learn how to be a better affirming adult and create better affirming spaces sometimes feels like a small act on your behalf, but just wanting to really kind of offer up to you the idea that maybe something that you learned tonight from us or from each other might really shift the experience of one of the students or staff in your spaces, and how that will not feel like a small thing for them. And if there are, you know, dozens of you out there taking this webinar and learning this content, that means there's dozens more of you after tonight out there better equipped to do this work. And over your lifetime of your career, how many people that could impact, it's a really big, you know, ripple effect. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Okay, so we have some time for questions and comments.
A practical question, and one that we often get: will this be recorded and can I view it later? The answer is absolutely. It's being recorded, and we'll be sending out the link in a follow-up email with the link to where you can access that. So thanks for asking that.
Great. Do you have resources?
Images of diverse families that staff can use in their classrooms and lesson plans. Absolutely. We don't have images themselves, but lots of ideas about how to do that yourself. So some of the lesson plans I shared might have some ideas around that. Again, we'll be following up with all the resources we've shared in the chat in a follow-up email.
Great. Since we have a little bit of time, and this is just kind of where I'm at, I know there's a comment in the chat about, I feel like when we don't include LGBTQ plus representation in the younger grades because they might not have figured out that they are LGBTQ plus, we're reinforcing the idea that being heterosexual or cisgender is the default and somehow turns LGBTQ as they get older. So I would like to say that I really appreciate that sentiment. I think creating affirming spaces from those grades is really essential to doing this work in a really foundational way. I know that for many of, so my wife and I have 9 nieces and nephews, and our wedding was actually the first wedding most of them had ever attended. So that was a queer wedding. That was their first experiences of weddings. And so for them, I know that like we have several queer identities in our family, and because of their small environment of having lots of representation and normalization in their environments, their ability to explore who they are and feel affirmed in who they are has been really significantly different than for some of their peers. So, I mean, we've seen that kind of firsthand. And I really would wish that for my daughter as she's going into SK this year, for sure. So I absolutely agree with you. Is there another question that came in, Jack? Did I see that?
No, but it's occurring to me that for the person who's looking for imagery that they can put on their bulletin boards in their schools, I'm not sure what the context is, if it's elementary or high school, but if there's anyone else in our attendees tonight who have ideas about that, I want to invite people to kind of share resources amongst each other, things that you've used, maybe celebrities as examples.
I know that one of my favorite books that we read for my daughter currently is Auntie Uncle, and it is this really lovely children's story about the fluidity of gender, and how this little person's auntie uncle saved a puppy at Pride and then has to decide how to show up to receive their award. Like, do they show up as this part of themselves or that part of themselves? And it just really, language is really age appropriate. So I know that, like, as far as books go, that recently when I was thinking of what comes to mind, that has been one of my favorites in our house anyways, when we're talking about gender fluidity. Oh, great. CCGSC have great posters that you can download, often full Trans Day of Visibility and other notable calendar days. I put them up in my high school. Great, thank you. That's good to know. So this kind of stuff is super helpful. The short story, The Gift by grades age limit. Excellent short story. Oh, good to know.
That's for grades 8 to 11. The
8
Gift.
to 11.
Just because the chat won't get captured in the recording, so I want to make sure everyone gets the benefit of the hearing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So some of your school boards may, I know that I've worked for some school boards that do actually have some kind of banks of images that might not just be broadly known about. So you may see that in some of your school boards, or you could share them with each other. I don't know. Okay. Jack, I'm just looking at the time. Do you want to move to the next piece?
I'll just amplify one other thing that someone is sharing. I welcome everyone to continue. We do have a few more minutes for Q&A, so keep your questions and comments coming. This is so valuable. Someone here has found a great resource on teachers pay teachers that I use with my grade 4s this year. That would be excellent for older grades as well. It was a poster that highlighted a 2S LGBTQ+ and an inspirational quote from that individual. That sounds great. If you have a link that you could share, that would be awesome too. Thanks so much.
I would actually also encourage you, this is just occurring to me, to think about when we are thinking about representation, about art or graphics, it's always a really wonderful idea to support 2S LGBTQI artists and folks themselves. And some of the easiest ways to find that content is through social media. So you can search hashtags on Insta. So I know I follow an account called Same Sex Families. They actually make a coffee table book of all of this really beautiful photography of different forms of same sex or same gender families, examples of that. So I mean, if you're looking for that out there and you want to be able to really like ethically support also 2S LGBTQI folks, you can check out social media and see, oftentimes like they have accounts on Etsy or other spaces that for really small amounts of money, you can get really beautiful art and content.
And someone has the option of getting students to design the posters themselves to put around the classroom. I love that.
Yeah, especially. I know that we use like Canva a lot for my work that makes things like really accessible for students if you're looking for kind of a group activity.
So I do want to announce, since we've got a couple more minutes, that we're going to be continuing the conversation at EGAL on affirming adults on Thursday at noon, and at 7 we've put together a panel of experts from across the school community on the conversation of affirming adults. Safe return to class. I'll share a link so that you can register for that and share it widely if you can. It'll be offered in French as well.
Yeah, so for those of you that are wanting to kind of hear more about what other folks are doing and continue the conversation, this is a great opportunity. And Jack will share that. So we're getting to the point where I'm going to have Jack wrap up for us. But again, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight and for participating in the chat. It always makes things so much richer for all of us when that happens. The learning really gets amplified. So thanks so much for being here. And maybe I'll see you again in another EGAL webinar at some point.
Thank you so much, Katie, for all your insight and wisdom. And I want to remind folks that we've got an evaluation feedback form. It's going to pop up in your browser as soon as you log out of the Zoom. It's really valuable for us to know how we can meet your needs as best we can. So do take a minute to fill that out. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, for all the amazing work that you're doing, and wishing everyone a safe return to the class. Take care.
Bye, folks.
Bye.